What's up guys, my name is Nathan, you're watching another Salty Productions YouTube video. Welcome to the Black set review for Tarkir Dragonstorm, which comes out on April 11th, 2025. We are going to get into all of the best black cards for the Commander format and a couple of honorable mentions. Before we get into the card discussions, just like to ask if you enjoyed this video, leave a like on the video and subscribe to see more. You know the deal, and you can check out my Patreon link down below. And if you want to see all of my other set reviews for the other colors, you can check those out, links down in the description as well. Our first card here is Thought-Provoking Rakshasa, which is going to be a 2-mana 5/5 body with Trample and Decayed, and we can pay some mana and put Decayed counters onto creatures. First of all, this card is absolutely going to shake up Standard. This is an insane aggro card that's going to see a ton of play in 1v1, but in Commander, I think this will more fit into Powers Matters decks. Anything that's running a Hunted Horror where you have a 2-mana 7/7 or a Sheltering Ancient, generally these effects tend to be in the Jund colors, so something like a Gerard Golgari Lichlord or Gitrog Ravenous Ride would want a Thought-Provoking Rakshasa, specifically with Gitrog, because if we were to send the Thought-Provoking Rakshasa into combat, it would be sacrificed anyway. We can instead saddle it with the Gitrog, get that value off of the Gitrog, and then it would die anyway. So a lot of value to be found here with Thought-Provoking Rakshasa, but only in, I think, Power Matters for the Commander format. Then we move to Sidisi, Regent of the Mire, which is going to be sort of a mini birthing pod effect that reanimates creatures out of a graveyard. This also resembles an Abyssal Harvester, where it takes some self-mill setup to get going. This one is a little bit hard to evaluate because, first of all, you need to have a lot of creatures in your graveyard to really get value out of this. I can't imagine that you would just incidentally have like a 4, 5, and 6 drop in your graveyard, although you could sort of build your deck around it to enable Sidisi to really be sort of mathematically optimized here. But generally, I think you're going to look for different loops where you can reanimate creatures that are going to ETB and self-mill you. So like a Stitcher Supplier into Undead Butler will actually mill you for 9 cards. I think that's sort of Magical Christmas Land. But generally, I think you're going to want to have creatures between 1 and 3 mana that are going to be self-milling you so that you have adequate targets for Sidisi. And that's not to say as well that she is a zombie herself, so will go well with all of your other zombie synergies. I always bring up Varina Lich Queen as being sort of that reanimation self-mill zombie commander, but really this does possibly deserve a slot in Varina. And of course, Sidisi Brood Tyrant also can get some zombie tribal synergies going and also cares about self-mill. So maybe we could consider Sidisi for these two decks, but will definitely take a lot of building around to get a lot of value. Then our next card here is Tip the Scales, which is going to be basically a 3-mana board wipe looking a lot like Toxic Deluge. This is the first time we have gotten the text, sacrifice a creature. When you do, all creatures get -X/-X until end of turn, where X is at sacrifice creature's toughness. We've never had something that cares about the creature's power or toughness or mana value or something like that. The closest comparison, probably, which is a little bit more niche, is Dead of Winter, but I like Tip the Scales better because we have more control over the creature that we can sacrifice to control that value of X, which is a lot of the value of Toxic Deluge as well, because you get to choose that. So for 3 mana, I think this is an absolutely excellent board wipe in Toughness Matters, but if we were outside of Toughness Matters, then we have some generic black creatures that you might find in any, sort of generic black deck, I suppose you could say. Pitiless Plunderer does have 4 toughness, and unfortunately it is a bit of an awkward comparison though, because if we were to sacrifice Pitiless Plunderer, then it wouldn't see all of the creatures die because it's sacrificed before everything has gotten -X/-X. But something like a Jinji, the Midnight Sky, if you don't have a sack outlet on board, this would be a way to get that death trigger, or just, generally if you are in any sort of death trigger matters type of deck, then, give Tip the Scales a look, because this is going to be a unique effect where we can get those death triggers and wipe the board at the same time. And of course, this will fit into Toughness Matters. Like I said, it was actually printed in Felithar the Steadfast, which actually did a precon upgrade guide. You can check that out, link down below as well. Then we move to Avenger of the Fallen, which has another unique effect, which is absolutely amazing to see. Love the card designs in Tarkir Dragonstorm. For 3 mana, we get a Death Touch 2/4 Human Warrior. Both of those creature types actually do matter and could see play in a lot of decks. Mobilize X, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So we're going to be making a bunch of tokens that sack themselves at the beginning of the next end step. And this is the first time where we've seen, create X tokens, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Ghoul Caller's Harvest is the closest comparison, which only says X is half the number of creature cards in your graveyard rounded up. So for 1 more mana, we're getting a much more potent token creation spell here. Blight Titan is a bit of an awkward comparison, but it does sort of a similar thing there. So this is going to matter a lot in Warrior Tribal decks. If you're in like a Zergo deck where it removes the end step sacrifice downside of those tokens, then that's going to be a ton of value to just stay on the battlefield while also having a 2/4 Death Touch, which cannot be understated and acts as a great rattlesnake. There's also the Obeka or Sundial of the Infinite type of effects that you can use with this card, which is where you just end the turn before the tokens can sack themselves. Just absolutely cool tech you can do there. So definitely would consider this in an Obeka deck. And then also if you're running like any sort of Zulaport Cutthroat or Dice triggers, this is going to be making a lot of tokens and a lot of death triggers that will then ping your opponents, for example. So of course you could also consider this for Ishin to get that attack trigger, although I will say my personal Ishin build really wants those tokens to stick around instead of just being sacrificed, but this definitely could make a lot of just attacking bodies, and it's really hard to block itself. And then of course, again, if you care about those death triggers, Teysa Karlov will double those. So Avenger of the Fallen, just a ton of value here and a really cool design. Then we move to Will of the Abzan, which is my personal favorite of all of the Will cycle in Tarkir Dragonstorm. If we control our commander, we can get both modes. We can edict our opponents for their creature with the greatest power, and we burn them for 3. And we can also reanimate a creature card from our graveyard. So even if we don't get both of the modes, I think that this card is still playable enough to be playable for either side of the mode. I do think the first mode is going to be more valuable than the second. Generally speaking, it's going to be more card advantage because you're going to kill your opponent's 3 best things and only for 1 card. And but if you already have like big Eldrazi in your graveyard or like a Sepulchral Primordial or something to reanimate, then we're happy to pay 4 mana to just reanimate a creature from our graveyard as is. So this is good on either side, and if you have both, then it is absolutely amazing, and I would say probably about 6 mana worth of effects there. So Soul Shatter is going to be the better comparison. However, we don't get the reanimation mode, and I will say Soul Shatter is at instant speed. So Will of the Abzan will not be replacing Soul Shatter in all of my decks. I tend to run it in pretty much any deck with black, and I just like it a lot more. And there's also Crackling Doom. We've seen that, Edict with greatest power effect, but it's been locked behind Mardu colors. So here we get just a better Edict that can go in any deck with black. So if you happen to be in a commander pairing with the background mechanic, then you can have a stickier form of your commander be sitting on the battlefield, which is really cool. Or you might want to consider running this in a commander that has really low mana value, 2 or 3 perhaps, so Lothal Corrupt Sheriff serving as a poster boy for all of the low CMC commanders out there, so that you can make sure you have your commander on the field before you then curve into Will of the Abzan. So just a great amount of value that can be found here. Our next card is Venerated Stormsinger. This is going to be just another Zulaport Cutthroat type of effect on a body that costs 4 mana. Now, is it better than Zulaport Cutthroat or Bastion of Remembrance? No, because it does cost 4 mana. However, this, out of all of the cards we will discuss today, I think is going to kill people the most because of the sheer prevalence of Aristocrats and Dying Matters types of decks that are out there in the wild. And this is just going to simply be the 3rd or 4th best effect in this deck, but it's going to be yet another addition to the toolbox, and of course it can trigger itself with that mobilize mechanic. Then we have Afterlife from the Loam, which is going to be an 8 mana delve, and we can reanimate up to 1 target creature card from each player's graveyard. So this is going to be doing just Breach the Multiverse things, but without the mill, and for probably less mana. Of course, if you're in a self-mill type of deck, it's pretty trivial to reduce the spell cost of this, given that you already have a graveyard chock full of things to exile. Sepulchral Primordial back in the day was, the best version of this effect, and I will still say it is a pretty decent reanimation target in today's day and age, but I think Afterlife from the Loam is a little bit better, but it isn't a creature body that we can reanimate. So you have some sort of, some ups and downs there, but I think generally, if you already run Breach the Multiverse, you'll probably replace it with Afterlife from the Loam, or if you're looking for a second version of Breach the Multiverse, just run both side by side. As far as the best commanders that could be running this, any sort of commander deck where you're going to be incidentally self-milling your opponents to have better choice of creatures and stuff to exile from your graveyard to fuel the delve. Something like the Wise Mothman or Anawan the Ruined Thief. Rogue Tribal does tend to have a mill sub-theme, but I don't like to lean into mill too much because I believe that mill does sort of power up your opponents with how much each deck can utilize their graveyard in 2025 Commander. Then that brings us to our honorable mentions. So cards that just didn't quite make the cut for the main set review. We have Worthy Cost, which is going to be the third version of Eaten Alive and Final Vengeance. The reason why I mention this is because there are, choice few effects in black that have an exile target creature text box. So if you care about exiling and you already want your creatures to die, give this a look. And also bonus points for the art. I think this art is just one of my favorites, I think, in the entire set. So much color going on, but also just displaying so much movement and sense of momentum. Really love the artwork in Worthy Cost. Then we go to Tival's Judgment, which is going to be a slightly worse version, in my opinion, than Monument to Endurance, because Tival's Judgment, we have to have cards leave our graveyard. Now, granted, it is a stickier permanent type, but I think it's a little bit harder to have cards leave your graveyard in general. You might need to cheese it with something like Delve or like Forage or something like that in order to really build around this card, but I think it's easier to build around Monument to Endurance, which is why I think it's just a little bit better than Tival's Judgment. Then we move to Within Range, which is going to be 4 mana for enchantment that makes 2/1/1s, and whenever you attack each opponent loses life equal to the number of creatures attacking them, which looks a lot like Hellrider. Personally, in my Ishin build, I believe I run Mishra, which will burn each opponent and gain life, and there's also another black creature that I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'll have on screen that also does the same thing. So with those two, specifically if you care about attacking in order to trigger a permanent that will burn your opponents, I would go with those two first because it nails each opponent. But then after that, if you want additional effects, you might want to look at Within Range. Hellrider can be board wiped, so there is some downside there, but it is a hasty body itself. But I think that's countered somewhat by the fact that Within Range creates those two 1/1 red warrior creature tokens and is a little bit easier to cast with only being 1 pip. So Within Range, an interesting little card there. And then we get to Welcome the Dead. 4 mana for a sorcery, draw 2, then discard a card and lose 2. And we create X tap 2/2 zombie creature tokens where X the number of cards that were put into your graveyard from your hand to library this turn, and as flashback. So if you're into some sort of zombie tribal deck where you're already going to want to be discarding cards to reanimate later, or you're in a self-mill shell already where you have some sort of permanence that's going to be milling on your upkeep, something like a Ripples of Undeath or like a Perpetual Timepiece, which you can tap for free to mill, then you might want to consider Welcome the Dead. But generally, I think this card is going to find a lot of competition, specifically in Varina decks, or just any sort of zombie self-mill deck. This archetype is already pretty much built out, and it's really hard to sort of break through all of the options we already have already, but it's nice that this does have flashback so we can cast it from the graveyard. Then we get to Cruel Truths, which is a shout out to the Pauper format. For 4 mana, we get an instant Surveil 2, then draw 2, you lose 2 life, which is Dire Sight, but 1 more mana. Now, of course, Dire Sight is sorcery speed. A Cruel Truth for 1 more mana, we do get instant speed. So I like this in any sort of control deck that happens to have black in its color identity to hold this up alongside your removal and utilize that instant speed. Then we move to Desperate Measures, which is going to be yet another sort of Village Rites effect. There's some trade-offs here. Desperate Measures is going to not always sacrifice the creature, but it is going to say when it dies under your control this turn. So you can sacrifice it with something like a Phyrexian Altar to actually make mana off of it and then get the card draw ability. Instead, with something like a Village Rites, you don't have to activate anything to sacrifice something to get the benefit of that sack outlet. So specifically, I'm thinking of like Viscera. You wouldn't get the Scry 1 if you were running something like a Village Rites in your deck. So I think Desperate Measures, it depends on your deck setup, whether it's better than our existing options. Village Rites, I think, will always guarantee the sack, and that's kind of nice to just guarantee it to draw those 2 cards. But if we're already running like 10 sack outlets in our deck, then I wouldn't care about that as much, and I'd probably run Desperate Measures instead. So that's an interesting little design there. Then we have Strategic Betrayal, which is going to be 2 mana for a sorcery. Target opponent exiles a creature they control and their graveyard. This is the very first time we have seen both an Edict and a Graveyard Sweeper effect printed onto one card, which is really cool. And we get the Exile effect instead of Destroy or Sacrifice, which I care about a lot in 2025 Commander. Like I said, it seems like every deck is playing out of their graveyard in some way. So the closest comparison I could find for this card would be something like a Rakdos Charm, which can sweep a player's graveyard or get rid of an artifact, or burn our opponents for a bunch of damage, which does win games, by the way. When they held a Magic Con Minneapolis in 2022, maybe, I forget the exact year, but Kathleen DeVere actually won the game off of casting Rakdos Charm, which was so cool to see. It was really, really fun time. But Strategic Betrayal, an interesting little option here. I don't know if I would truly run this card and if it would make the cut. It definitely would be more of a budget option, but I'm just thinking, like, I'd still probably rather run a normal Edict effect because we do get 3 of our opponent's creatures. I guess it just depends on whether you care about that graveyard sweeping effect and what other graveyard hate you're already running in your deck. And that will bring us to our top 3 black cards from Tarkir Dragonstorm. And if we could get a drum roll, please, we have Afterlife from the Loam, Will of the Abzan, and Venerated Stormsinger. So Afterlife from the Loam is going to get you so much mana and card advantage by reanimating just a bunch of creatures onto the board, and it already kicks out an already power crept and powerful spell in Breach the Multiverse. Just absolutely insane that Breach the Multiverse has already sort of been crept out. Will of the Abzan doing a ton of work, just a ton of work if you control your commander, but even if we're not, as the absolute floor of this card, we are still happy to cast it, which is why I think it's the most powerful of the will cycle. And then Venerated Stormsinger, out of all the cards we've discussed, is going to be killing people the most because this is going to be just your 3rd best Zulaport Cutthroat type of effects. And given the prevalence of Aristocrats effects and all of the decks out there that care about their creatures dying, Venerated Stormsinger is going to be doing a ton of work and actually fuels itself via the Mobilize 1 mechanic. So I think you're going to be seeing Venerated Stormsinger the most out of all of these cards today. So that is going to conclude my black color set review for Tarkir Dragonstorm. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like on it and subscribe if you want to see more, and you can check out my Patreon link down below. Finally, if you want to see all of my other set reviews at an easy click, those will be on screen now.